Hello, Great Faith Groups, and welcome to the week looking at a soul fathered by God. This week we're looking at what does it mean that we find our primary identity as children of God. This is an ultimate truth that is so important for us to understand. My kids have now, all three of them are still at home. They're not out on their own yet. They have done many things in their life, some good, some great, some fun, some dumb. They have played sports. They have gone to school. They have had friends. They have had dating relationships. They've done all of these things. But when it comes down to it, when they come home, they're my kids. And I don't change that based on how good of a day they had or how bad of a day they had. I don't change that on what they think about a situation in their life or not. But when they come home, they're my kids. That's how I know them, and that's how they know themselves. And that's how it is with us and God. The primary way God knows us is as his children. And the primary way we should know God is as his children. This is how we should identify ourselves. And we live in a day and age with a world around us that is giving us every other thing under the sun to identify ourselves by. Do you identify yourselves by your wealth? Do you identify yourselves by your achievements, by your titles? Do you identify yourself by ethnicity or race or by gender? Do you identify yourself by any of these things? And these things are all part of who we are. But our primary identity, the primary thing in our soul should be that we are children of God. And I want to look at two things from the prodigal son story, actually from both sons in the story, the one who returned and the one who remained, to look at what it means, or I guess, let me rephrase that, to look at how we should see ourselves in light of that we're his children. And the first thing we learn is from the son who returned. This is the son who at first rebelled, who went and wasted through poor decisions and bad living all that the father had given him out of his grace and kindness and love. And he comes back home and he's accepted. But it's interesting, when he comes back home, and this story is in Luke 15, he comes back home, he said his plan is to say to the father, I'll be a servant. But the father says, no, you will be my son. And so he comes back home and the son must accept this status. And that's the first thing it means to know that God is our Father and we are his children, is that we are accepted. God accepts us. We have, I put it this way, we have refrigerator rights in the house. You see, my kids don't have to knock on the door to come home. They don't have to ask permission to open the fridge or open the cupboards. They don't have to ask permission to use the things that are in the house, to use the TV, to use the bathroom, any of those things. They know that they're accepted in my home because they are my children. And this is the same with God. He saw his son. He knew what his son had done, but he said, son, I accept you. And he brought him in. And so one of our primary ways that we understand that we are children of God is we understand we're accepted. And you might be like me, and you might have returned to God. And there are a lot of things I did in my past that I wish I hadn't, that I had to repent of and receive forgiveness for. But what made it possible for me to receive that forgiveness was understanding that underlying God's forgiveness was his acceptance of me as his son. Now, I want to clarify this for a second. God accepts you as his child. Just because you are accepted does not mean everything you do is acceptable. My kids know that they're my children, but they know what they are and they are not allowed to do in our home. And they know that if they do some of those things, I'm not going to kick them out on the street, but we're going to have to bring correction because I know as a father it's not the best for them. And so I think today a lot of people in their attempt to feel accepted by God have taken that to mean that God must accept me and everything I do is acceptable. See, God accepts us. We understand that God accepts us, but he is the one who determines what is acceptable. And so I want to challenge you that when you say and understand that who you are, and the deepest parts of who you are, your value, your identity is accepted by God, that doesn't mean everything you're doing is acceptable. And in fact, if we're children, of God, wanting to live in his home, wanting to live in the fullness of that acceptance, we should look at our behavior and say, is what I'm doing acceptable to my Father? You see, I'm guessing that the son that returned home never asked again for an early inheritance. I'm guessing that the way he wasted money, he stopped living like that. In fact, there's a story in the Bible where a woman is brought to Jesus. She's been caught in adultery, and there are those who are saying to Jesus, basically, is she innocent or not? We want to accuse her. And he says one thing to the group of people. He says to them, hey, if you're without sin, go ahead, throw the first stone. And often people tell the story and they stop there and they say we shouldn't judge people, and they're right. But then Jesus says something to the woman that I think we must also hear. He says, if they don't condemn you, neither do I. In other words, he's saying, I accept you. But then he says, now go and sin no more. And Jesus would say to you, hey, you're accepted, but there might be some areas that are not acceptable, and it's time to stop sinning. And if you see those areas this week and you know I'm accepted, but what I'm doing is unacceptable, simply repent. Simply turn away from them. Stop doing those things that you might live in the fullness of the acceptance. And it's that fullness of the acceptance that leads to the second aspect of what it means to be children of God I want to look at this week. And we learn this from the older brother in the story. And that is this, that if we are accepted as children of God, we have access to everything that is our Father's. In the story of the prodigal son, the older brother comes in and he's a little bit ticked off. He's very jealous. He says, this son of ours is gone. He's wasted your living, or your money through his living, all this kind of stuff. And he says, Dad, you've never done this for me. And his dad looks at him and said, son, everything I have has always been yours. In other words, we have access to all that is the Father's. We have access to the power, the wealth, the status, the authority that is the Father's. Now we need to understand it's God's. We have access to it as his sons. We can come and say, hey, can you throw me a feast? But this doesn't mean we have demand of it. And what I mean by that is we can't just demand God pay the bill because we wasted some money yesterday. But we know that we have access to God's finances, and we can come to him as a child and say, God, would you provide the finances I need for this? God, would you provide the power that I need for this? God, would you provide the authority that I need for this? Now, like any good father, he might say, yes, here's what I want you to do to be able to handle that, to be able to carry that well. But we have the access to everything God has. He's just waiting for us to come and ask for it. So our primary identity is that we are children of God. And that means that we're accepted by God for who we are, and we have access to everything that he has.